purpose this afternoon will be to look briefly at the major European empires, the Spanish as well as the British, the Dutch as well as the German, and the Belgian and Italian as well as the French, simply to review the common ground of empire. I will begin by placing the subject within the context of recent historical debate on violence and torture, asking the larger question, was there an element of repression in all colonial regimes that resembled that of Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union? During the past months, I have been involved in the discussion about recently released colonial archives representing no fewer than 37 colonial administrations in all parts of the world. The trigger of the release is the lawsuit against the British government brought by survivors of the Mau Mau movement of the 1950s. Without the court demanding legal evidence, these files probably would never have seen the light of day. I think it's useful in this regard to bear in mind certain classic works of fiction, including Graham Greene's The Heart of the Matter, because Greene was an intelligence officer in Sierra Leone during the World War II. Naipaul's Bend in the River, set in the Eastern Congo, and Paul Scott's Raj Quartet. It was Scott who created the evil figure of Ronald Merrick. And the question arises in the case of recent controversy whether other figures of the Ronald Merrick prototype existed in Kenya and elsewhere. At the end of the Raj Quartet, the file on Merrick was destroyed by someone in the Indian civil service, because public knowledge of his case would have brought the reputation of the Indian police into disrepute. So we are talking in a more general way about the reputation or myth of the British district officer, what he represented to the world at large, and how his reputation in recent decades, not only the British district officer, but his European equivalents, has survived from a non-European perspective as well as a European. We are talking, in other words, about one of the themes of our discussion this afternoon, legacy and memory. Now, I begin with mentioning the importance of geography as part of historical background. As you'll see, we begin with map 1, which is Africa during the time of the colonial regimes in Africa. In the early 20th century, colonial regimes, colonial empires were associated with ideas of national greatness, competitiveness, and the survival of the fittest. Only the fittest nations and the fittest empires would survive. Great powers should possess great empires, if necessary, at the expense of lesser empires. Before 1914, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, spoke of the Portuguese colonies as sinks of iniquity or dens of evil, and thought it would be merely a matter of time until they were partitioned between Germany and Britain. The possession of the weaker colonial powers would be absorbed by the stronger, just as the territories of the dying nations of Turkey and China would be annexed by the more virile European nations. The drive for empire contributed to a spirit of ruthless militarism, and it is thus ironic that the Portuguese, regarded at the time by everyone as the weakest of the European powers, virtually outlasted them all. Let me begin by placing this in a British context, because the British Empire was distinct, among other reasons, because of India, an empire in its own right extending over 1,200,000 square miles. Could we have map 2 on India? And I would say or remark that Texas is only 270,000 square miles, and India was thus 270,000 square miles plus 1 million square miles larger and possessed a population of some 300 million. Now, the remarkable figure about all of this, which you all know, is that India was administered by only 1,000 British civilian officers of the Indian Civil Service. Now, think of that for a minute. 1,000 civilians ruling a population of over 300 million over a continent virtually the size of Europe. But then think again, because the civilian officers were backed up by a police contingent of about 150,000 and the British Indian Army of about 250,000 plus the Royal Navy. And the police element was ruthless. This has been commented on by an article by Perry Anderson in the present issue of the London Review of Books, which is an interesting review for you to bear in mind because it is interesting for radical criticism of conventional ideas. So let's begin with the tour of the European colonial empires, and I begin with the smallest of them, the Spanish. The loss in 1898 of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States and the Pacific Islands to Germany reduced the Spanish Empire mainly to Spanish Sahara. And I mention Spanish Sahara because it remains controversial, and recent work has argued that it has never been decolonized but merely taken over or usurped as a part of Morocco. Now, to contemporaries observing this fate of the Spanish Empire, much of which was taken over by the United States, it seemed inevitable that the weak had given way to the strong. No one anticipated the lifespan of the great colonial empires, that they would be relatively short. The preponderant view at the turn of the 20th century held that the new empires would last at least for 1,000 years. Yet within 100 years, or what the Spanish called the catastrophe of 1898, even the empire of the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of the last century. Now, here is my return to the central argument, and concerns what one writer has called the mythological beast of the colonial state, referred to by earlier writers as the colonial Leviathan, which possessed certain qualities of the European states. The colonial regimes, known collectively as the colonial state, were nascent sovereign units. The colonial state collected taxes and defended frontiers. It administered justice, arbitrary justice perhaps, and collected taxes as well. Its character varied slightly from French to British, from Dutch to Portuguese and Belgian. With few exceptions, each colonial regime attempted to become fiscally self-sufficient. In the stage of military conquest, which lasted roughly up to 1914, the colonial state conscripted labor in such projects as road building and railway construction to create the basis for self-sustaining flows of revenue. In its apex, roughly the interwar years, the colonial state extended the reach and the police and the degree of productivity, while it encouraged the indispensable collaboration of indigenous soldiers, clerks, traders, and later journalists, teachers, and lawyers. And the last stage, after World War II, the collaborators increasingly became nationalists who used Western languages to define their own ambitions as well as national identities and to wrest political control from the Europeans. The legacy of the colonial state helps to explain the nature of the 52 successor sovereign states, including Idi Amin's Uganda, Bokasso's Central African Republic, and Mobutu's Zaire. Again, it is an element of repression that is a component of the colonial state that carries over into its post-colonial incarnation. The German Empire, created in 1884 and extinguished in 1919. As you can see, most of it was concentrated in Africa. The size of German East Africa was nearly double that of Imperial Germany. And the other German colonies included Southwest Africa, the Cameroons, Togo, the Pacific, and the Germans possessed as well German New Guinea, otherwise known as Kaiser Wilhelmsland. Germany also occupied lesser territories in Asia and the Pacific, including Kaichou in China, the Bismarck Archipelago, part of the Samoan Group, and the Caroline, Mariana, and Marshall Islands north of the equator. But only a few regions in Southwest Africa and East Africa actually attracted settlers. For German settlers in the early 20th century, Texas was much preferred to Togoland. Despite the brutal suppression of a revolt in Southwest Africa in 1904-1907 and an uprising in German East Africa in 1905-1906, the Germans were no more, but no less perhaps, barbaric than the French in Algeria, the British in Kenya, or the Belgians in the Congo before 1908. This connects with recent work by Caroline Elkins and David Anderson and the theme of possible genocide, if genocide it was, in Kenya and elsewhere. A common fallacy was that the colonies were vital to Germany's economic prosperity. Far from being an asset, however, all of the German colonies before 1914, except Togoland, which was productive in cocoa and rubber, all of these required subsidies. German financiers, as well as immigrants, demonstrated a distinct preference for Eastern Europe and the Americas rather than for the colonies. Now, there has been recent work on the German colonies, not least an excellent book on Karl Peters and a monograph on Southwest Africa, arguing that the themes connect directly with those of the Holocaust. Well, the German Empire was a casualty of the First World War. In 1919, Germany lost her place in the sun, and with it, an unprofitable empire. In the 1930s, it seemed possible that some of the colonies might be restored or other territory in Africa ceded to Germany at the expense of Belgium and Portugal. And it remains debatable how the social engineering of the Third Reich might have affected Black Africa and whether or not the Holocaust might have taken a slightly different direction with such places as East Africa available, as the Nazis called it, as a dumping ground for Jews and Gypsies. The only thing that can be said with certainty is that after 1945, the Germans were spared the trauma of decolonization. During the First World War, Britain and France emerged as major Middle Eastern powers and increased their colonial domains in Africa. But the public mood began to change. The European powers now paid lip service, at least, to the ideal that the colonies would be held in trust until the native peoples could eventually stand on their own. Germany not only lost her colonies, but through British propaganda, acquired a reputation of a barbarous power unfit to govern native peoples. The German colonies were overrun by the British with the help of Indian troops and by French, Belgians, South Africans, Australians, New Zealanders, and the Japanese during World War I. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled by the British and the French, and to a lesser degree by the Italians. The smaller colonial empires of the Dutch, the Belgians, and the Portuguese remained intact, and so also did the larger empires of France and Britain, but for the transcendent reason that Britain was an ally of Japan. It was Japan's policing of the eastern seas that enabled the British to concentrate in European waters and thereby contributed to Allied victory and the maintenance of the Allied empires. Germany, or rather Japan, defeated China in 1884, 1895, and Russia in 1904-1905. It was during this time that Japanese influence increased both in China and the Pacific. In 1919, the German islands north of the equator became Japanese mandated territories. The next map that gives you some idea of the Marianas, the Marshalls, and the Carolines. As in Germany, in the 1930s, there emerged in Japan the doctrine that markets and raw materials were necessary for survival. After 1931, Japan occupied Manchuria. To the south, the greater co-prosperity sphere during the Second World War aimed to secure Japanese economic and political hegemony in Southeast Asia. In the early part of the war, the Japanese conquest of the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies, as well as control of Indochina, demonstrated the vulnerability of the Western regimes in Asia. Now, had the Japanese emerged undefeated from the Second World War, Southeast Asia might have become part of an autarkic bloc, not dissimilar to what the British had in mind with the Sterling area. The islands north of the equator would probably have been swamped with Japanese immigrants and might have become assimilated as an outlying territory of Japan. In any event, after 1945, the loss of colonial possessions demonstrated that Germany, like Japan, did not need a place in the sun to recover economically. Now, the Italian colonial empire was another casualty of the Second World War. At the turn of the century, Ethiopia had not only remained free from European control, but had inflicted a humiliating defeat on the Italians at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, 1935-1936, aimed at the establishment of a neo-Roman East African empire. Italy's domain in East Africa included Eritrea, with some 5,000 Italians, and Italian Somaliland, 1 3/4 the size of Italy, with some 1,500 Italians. Now, the numbers of Italians are significant because of the obsession with excess population that characterized Italian public attitudes of the 1930s. The principal outlet for immigration was Libya, which Italy had won by conquest from Turkey in 1911. In the interwar years, Libya became Italy's fourth shore, and in 1938 had an Italian population of about 100,000, a figure that bears comparison with only 20,000 whites in Kenya, but 400,000 Jews in Palestine, and nearly 1 million Europeans in Algeria. Libya, under Italian rule, became one of the most urbanized countries of North Africa. The Italian fascist government built extensive harbors and roads, but resettled the local Muslim nomads near the desert, thereby reducing their numbers drastically, perhaps by half. These projects were pursued for the greater glory of the Italian fascist state, but to the end they remain a drain on the Italian budget and devastating to the indigenous population. Now, the Second World War destroyed another colonial system of much greater substance and longevity, and here is Jen's territory, the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch had held territories since the 17th century. In the West Indies, the colonial possessions included Suriname. In the East Indies, in the vast Indonesian archipelago of 13,000 islands extending well over 3,000 miles from east to west, the Dutch had developed a colonial economy producing tobacco, tea, coffee, sugar, copra, tin, coal, rubber, and oil. In neither the 19th century nor the First World War did the Dutch Empire expand territorially. Its scope remained the same in 1939 as it had been in 1815. But from the late 19th century onwards, the expansion of the economy brought to the East Indies a new Dutch population of businessmen and civil servants. By 1939, there were 250,000 Dutch, which is well less than a quarter of the number of people who now live in Austin, Texas. Many of the Dutch had regarded the East Indies as their home. They had raised children there, they retired there, and they later became embittered during the post-war struggle leading to Dutch eviction. The size of the indigenous population had risen from 6 million to 30 million in the 19th century and to 70 million by 1940. Dutch rule in part reflected the problem of how to govern such a vast and changing population. The Dutch, from early on, preserved native dynasties and ruled through them. Like the British system, and in contrast with the French, the Dutch system was characterized by decentralization and indirect rule. The extent of Dutch influence in densely populated areas such as Java, as well as the outlying areas, was diverse and uneven. The Japanese occupation in 1942 broke the continuity of Dutch rule. The Dutch were interned, and the Indonesian elite assumed administrative positions that they had previously been denied. By enlisting the support of both nationalist and Islamic leaders, the Japanese fostered the nationalist movement. After the war, the Dutch expected to reassert their control, but a long and acrimonious struggle ended when the United States sided with the nationalists and against their European allies. The new nation of Indonesia achieved independence in 1949. In the West, it was regarded as one of the two great Asian events of the year, the other being the emergence of the communist regime in China. I now come to the empires that endured into the latter part of the 20th century, the Belgian, the French, the British, and the Portuguese. There were similarities. Each colony had what was known as a steel frame of military, police, and administrative officers who maintained order and defended the frontiers. A European outpost might consist merely of a district officer, a few interpreters, and a small military detachment. At the beginning of the century, the Portuguese Empire, more than the others, lacked both military and administrative resources to go much beyond minimal occupation. Virtually all colonies developed revenue systems based on taxation of crops, which sometimes involved forced labor or its equivalent. Each colonial power exported a simplified form of its own government and law and each colony possessed a system of justice, though this often amounted to unrestricted and arbitrary authority. As administrative units of the European powers, the colonies were also nascent states, each in the process of acquiring the modernizing characteristics of the states of Europe. Each colonial system invested in ports, roads, and railways, as well as in education and health measures against, for example, sleeping sickness. By mid-centuries, each had developed a network of government offices complete with files, typewriters, and telephones. Earlier, it probably did not much matter whether an African, for example, happened to be under one regime or another. By mid-century, it mattered a great deal. Each colonial system came to possess distinctive characteristics that have endured in the post-colonial period to the present. The Belgian Congo, by mid-century, had acquired the reputation, in Europe at least, as a model colony, and this had not always been the case. Under the autocratic regime of King Leopold 50 years earlier, the Congo had been notorious. King Leopold ruled in the Congo in his own right, not as king of the Belgians. His regime was exploitative and rapacious. Africans were compelled to collect a quota of wild rubber under penalty of punishment that sometimes led to abuses of authority, including severe beatings. Leopold himself demanded profits, but his administrative apparatus proved too weak to prevent abuses. In 1908, Belgium annexed the Congo to remedy the disastrous rule of King Leopold. The immense colony of the Congo extended over nearly 1 million miles, 80 times larger than Belgium, and the Belgians themselves never numbered more than 100,000. The resources included copper, diamonds, and uranium, as well as tropical agricultural products such as rubber, palm oil, and cotton. Mining was far and away the most valuable part of the economy. By European standards at the time, Belgian rule was benevolent and efficient. No other colony had better labor conditions, health facilities, or primary education, and no other was as paternalistic. Catholic missions provided for primary school attendance of over 50%, the highest in Africa, but very few Africans went on to secondary schools and fewer still to universities. By the time of independence, the Belgian Congo had produced only 16 Congolese with university training. In December 1959, riots at Leopoldville shook the Belgian administration into a belated recognition of the strength of Congolese political movements. The Belgians now made a fundamental miscalculation, fearing that troubles might escalate into the equivalent of the Algerian Revolution, and nevertheless assuming that the Congolese could never manage without them, the Belgians decided in favor of immediate independence on 30 June 1960. The Congo quickly slid into anarchy. The summer of 1960 will always be remembered as the time as one of the great disasters in European decolonization. The phrases Congo and post-colonial chaos became synonymous. The Portuguese Empire was the last to be liquidated, and it was in every sense an anachronism. Paradoxically, by the time that the other European colonial empires were in their death throes, the Portuguese had lost nothing until India seized Goa in 1961. And the question does arise in one's mind, was India a post-colonial imperial power with imperial ambitions despite an anti-colonial attitude. The principal colonies, Portuguese colonies, were the immense territories of Angola in Western Africa and Mozambique in Eastern Africa. These regions had been discovered by Vasco da Gama and others in the 15th century and held a vital place in the Portuguese national psyche. Portugal's other colonies included Portuguese Guinea in Western Africa and minor territories throughout the world, including Macau, off the coast of China near Canton and Hong Kong. In the first decade of the 20th century, the Portuguese were able to uphold their largely fictional claims to the vast hinterlands of Angola and Mozambique only because of the other colonial powers not wanting to see the territories fall into the hands of their rivals. By 1910, no more than a tenth of each colony was under actual Portuguese control. The effective colonizing instrument evolved in the shape of chartered companies or concessions dominated by British capital. To develop plantations, the companies relied on forced labor, which roused international humanitarian protest until the reform of labor laws in the 1920s. Portugal acquired a reputation of a harsh and despotic colonial power, almost competing with that of King Leopold's regime in the Congo, but the reason lay in Portugal's own poverty and the carrying over of 19th century labor practices into the 20th. Portugal herself was an underdeveloped country. The Portuguese had not experienced an industrial revolution and did not have a humanitarian movement. In the Renaissance of the Portuguese state in the 1920s, the mystique of empire continued to hold a prominent place. By mid-20th century, the Portuguese colonies had been brought into line with the other European colonies, though observers commented on a 20-year time lag. There was less of a color bar than in any of the other European colonies. The Portuguese viewed Angola and Mozambique as multiracial societies on the model of Brazil. They regarded the colonies as an integral part of the Portuguese state. But by 1950, there were only negligible numbers of assimilated Africans in Angola and Mozambique. In 1961, a nationalist rising began in Angola, and for another decade, Portugal now fought rebel forces in all three of the African colonies. It is a measure of the vitality of the Portuguese colonial mission that the military commitment reached nearly 200,000 troops, which represented a huge number of soldiers for a country with a population of only 8 million. The Portuguese devoted half of their national budget to the colonial war effort. In the end, the Portuguese colonial empire in Africa died in 1974 as much a result of a revolution in Portugal as defeat in the colonies. The Portuguese, the reason I've been elaborating on this is because the Portuguese historians, including former Portuguese seminarians, have been among the most active in pursuing issues of decolonization. Now, before the Second World War, the French Empire stood as the only worldwide empire comparable to that of the British. In 1939, it extended over some 5 million square miles and had a population of 65 million. Algeria, administered directly as part of France, was the major colony of settlement and had nearly 1 million Europeans and over 6 million Muslims, with one of the highest rates of population growth in the world. Other parts of the North African and Middle Eastern Empire included the protectorates over Tunisia and Morocco, and the mandated territories of Syria and Lebanon. In Southeast Asia, and the French held sway over Indochina. In the Pacific, France possessed Tahiti and various island groups, as in the Caribbean. In tropical Africa, the French domain was larger than any of the other colonial powers, extending from southern Algeria to the Congo and to the east to the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. French possessions further included French Somaliland, Madagascar, and island groups in the Indian Ocean. In all of these territories, the aim, or at least one distinct aim, since the time of the French Revolution, had remained the same. France's republican heritage and civilization would be offered to its subjects, allowing them to become assimilated as French citizens. The empire would be an integral part of France. But in the early part of the century, it had already become clear that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to assimilate entire societies in such places as Algeria, Indochina, and Black Africa. In 1922, there were only 94 black citizens in West Africa. The project of transforming Arabs and black Africans into Frenchmen obviously had its limit. But the idea of assimilation did not disappear. The French colonial minister, after the First World War, called for investment to develop the colonies and to make the colonial economies interdependent with the metropolitan economy. Now, this is significant because the French proved themselves, and are still proving themselves, consistently more willing to provide money and to commit military forces than any of the other colonial powers. The universalist assumptions of French republican philosophy and civilizing mission might be impractical, but economic and military commitment helped the French to produce a small, assimilated elite committed to French civilization to the present. No comparison with those committed to Francophonie. The demise of France as a Middle Eastern power was the result of only the Second World War, which also sapped French strength in Indochina. The year 1954 marked a humiliating and decisive French defeat at Dien Bien Phu and effectively ended France's empire in Asia. In the same year, the French government reinforced Algeria. One of de Gaulle's supreme achievements after his return to power in 1958 was the resolution of both the future of Algeria and the fate of the colonial empire. In 1958, de Gaulle presented the Africans with a clear choice. They could decide in favor of independence and a privileged place within the French community with the continuation of economic and military assistance, or in favor of unfettered independence and the abrupt breaking of all links. Only Sékou Touré of Guinea chose to sever the bond with France. One of the consequences was the French departure, was the French ripping out of all telephones in French Guinea. All of the rest remained within the French Union. And in April 1961, de Gaulle survived a military revolt of the French army in Algeria and moved decisively towards Algerian independence. It was Algeria that captured the world's imagination, in part because of the movie, the one that we will see later this week, The Battle of Algiers, which dramatically conveys the message that nearly 500,000 troops, sophisticated weapons, and torture could not destroy a revolution, aiming at national freedom. In July 1962, de Gaulle proclaimed Algeria independent. Now, the British Empire differed from the French colonial system above all by the possession of India and by the autonomous dominions. At the turn of the century, India constituted an empire in its own right, with a territorial scope of nearly 2 million square miles and a population of 300 million. So India alone had a population nearly 5 times that of the entire French colonial empire. And it's a measure not merely of firepower, but of British confidence and prestige that India was administered by mystique, as I have mentioned, by fewer than 1,000 members of the Indian civil service. The Indian police and the Indian army had a corps of somewhere between 250,000 to 500,000 that made Britain the greatest military power in Asia at the early part of the 20th century. During this time, the dominions of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa had become self-governing and virtually independent. By formally marking the birth of the Commonwealth, the Statute of Westminster of 1931 merely recognized the actuality of nations of kith and kin freely associating in self-interest. Now, until 1947, the Commonwealth had remained an exclusive white man's club representing only a small part of a still vast empire that had reached its greatest territorial extent in the interwar years. In the 1939 in the Caribbean, British colonies included Jamaica, Trinidad, British Guiana, Honduras, the Leewards, the Windwards, the Bahamas, and Bermuda. In the Pacific, Britain administered Fiji, Tonga, and smaller island groups. In East and Southeast Asia, the empire included Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma, Singapore, parts of Borneo. In the Middle East, Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, the British ruled over Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus, Palestine, Jordan, Aden, Persian Gulf protectorates, Ceylon, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. The African territories included the Gambia, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, Nigeria, the Cameroons, the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, Somaliland, Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, and so on. And this list is by no means complete. The British Empire and Commonwealth was a complex worldwide system stretching over 12.2 million square miles, roughly 1/4 of the Earth's surface, that included territories acquired during every stage of colonization since the 16th century. Now, in retrospect, the interwar years represent the apex of British colonialism, at least in the imagination. The district officer inspired or attempted to inspire trust in his subjects as well as in the British public that colonial rule was just and enlightened, as portrayed in the famous movie Saunders of the River. The reality was more complicated, but the fictional accounts usually conveyed the essential point that British rule depended on indigenous authority. In 1922, Sir Frederick Lugard's famous book, The Dual Mandate, developed the doctrine of indirect rule, in other words, of allowing local administration to be left in the hands of hereditary chiefs. In India, the goal was to secure local collaboration without weakening British control. The aim was the same in India and Africa, to win over the nationalists before they became embittered enemies of the British. And for a while, it appeared that the strategy might succeed. In 1945, no one would have believed that the end would come so quickly, though it was already clear that India could not be held to the empire. The Labour government was committed to India's freedom, and in any event, economic and military weakness dictated a retrenchment. The dismantling of the British Empire began first in Asia by the granting of independence to India and Pakistan in 1947, and about the same time to Ceylon and Burma. All except Burma remained in the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth provided a sort of psychological cushion during the era of decolonization. In 1948, the British were driven out of Palestine, in part because of the intervention by the United States in favor of the Zionists and the creation of the State of Israel. Now, it might be tempting to regard these events as the beginning of a preordained decline and fall, but it did not seem so to those at the time who hoped to rejuvenate the empire in the Middle East and Africa. With India and Palestine shrugged aside, Africa would be developed as a replacement for India, and the oil of the Middle East would sustain Britain as a great world power. The collapse of the empire would be prevented by genuinely coming to terms with African and Middle Eastern nationalists as equals and not treating them as inferiors as in the earlier period. Such was the aspiration. Now, my concluding remarks will be on recent historical controversy on torture and violence, and the reason that these trends preoccupy us today. Part of the background is the broken or the fragmentary nature of the historical record. Because of an ongoing court case in London, the records of 37 colonial dependencies have been or are being forced open. These include the colonial records of Aden, Cyprus, Kenya, Malaya, curiously enough, not Guyana, for reasons concerning the CIA that has been mentioned in our discussion. And these are by no means complete. In other words, these are the records of colonial administrations that were sent back to London before independence. Now, in the British cases, the instruction went out that great care should be taken with all of the secret and sensitive papers that might be embarrassing if passed on to officials of successor governments. Confidential and secret papers would be destroyed before independence or sent back to London. For the most part, for example, in Aden, officials destroyed virtually all sensitive records, such as those of interrogation and what is called enhanced persuasion, before the British evacuation. Now, there is nothing at all new about this. Lord Mountbatten, as Viceroy in August 1947, had complained that the clouds of smoke coming from burning archives might jeopardize the independence ceremonies. In Malaya, even a huge railway boiler proved to be insufficient for the burning of documents, and it required 5 army trucks to haul files to the Singapore naval base for their destruction. The colonial archives that have survived help to explain the progression of such officials as R.G. Turnbull, whom I use as an example, because he held the job of Chief Secretary in Kenya, and then became the governor of Tanganyika, and then the governor of Aden. And the colonial archives that have been released recently in London and are being released in this year and on to the next, thus illuminate colonial service career paths. For example, from the West Indies, one might expect to go on to West Africa, Ghana, or Nigeria, and from there on to Cyprus. If one began a career in Palestine, then Malaya and then Kenya might be destinations. Governor Grantham of Hong Kong had served in Bermuda and Fiji. In the case of Kenya, one official went on to Sarawak and ended his career in the Gulf states. And my purpose in mentioning these representative experiences or career arcs is that colonial officials, as in the case of the French colonies, for example, took with them what they had learned previously. The progression from one job to the next in the colonial service leads to the question, indirectly at least, was Kenya exceptional? Some colonial service officers had served elsewhere and went on elsewhere, as in my example of Richard Turnbull, who somewhere while moving from Kenya to Tanganyika to Aden acquired a parrot, which eventually earned a footnote in the history of the British Empire, because Turnbull taught the parrot to swear before repeating the Lord's Prayer. I'm using Turnbull as an example, and the idiosyncratic detail because he was a pretty tough fellow. He regarded himself as a man of stern ethical principle, and he certainly was knowledgeable about the darker side of the police in Kenya. So would he have regarded Kenya as exceptional? I've come to believe within the last year that this is the wrong question. Kenya, like Algeria, was at one end of the colonial spectrum. I think that Turnbull and others of his time would have acknowledged the wide-ranging spectrum, just as he would have regarded some of the police action in Kenya as unspeakable and unmentionable. And again, there is nothing new about the evidence of police brutality in Kenya, including the insertion of shards of broken glass into the vaginas of Kikuyu women. In effect, we are talking, or it was regarded at the time, as a potential cause of national shame, as well as a slur on the record of the colonial service. And this is one of the reasons why these records are only now beginning to emerge. In other words, at the time, the less said, the better. In talking this over recently with Sir James Craig, the foremost Arabist of his generation, he says that he simply would have destroyed the records. Too much to live with, unspeakable and unmentionable. In other words, we are talking about the destruction of colonial archives that is at variance with the necessity to maintain official files and have an official records. So the question is then, was Kenya at one end of the colonial spectrum then systemic? Would police methods have been similar in the Rhodesias or Aden? Well, the spirit of Hannah Arendt lives on. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, written back in the 1950s, she argued that violence and repression are in the nature of colonial bureaucracy and thus similar in kind to that of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But bear in mind the scale of the comparison. To my mind, nothing in Kenya, or for that matter in Algeria, can compare with the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis or the sheer number killed in Soviet labor camps. I agree with John Darwin's point that if the British, or for that matter the Americans, had such systematic intent, they were remarkably inept in pursuing it. But this is an open question and certainly one that is worth pursuing. Now, we now know from the works of David Anderson and Caroline Elkins, drawing on the Kenyan archives, that the Secretary of State for the Colonies, Alan Lennox Boyd, had full knowledge of the secret beatings, his own phrase, and torture. At the time, this was a very dangerous political point because the Kenyan police were using methods of persuasion usually associated with countries behind the Iron Curtain, as Barbara Castle pointed out in the House of Commons. The Colonial Office, and perhaps even the Cabinet, were divided on the point of coercion, some thinking that it was justified and necessary, others believing that it was contrary to British standards of justice. And bear in mind that the British in the 1950s believed that they had the highest police standards in the world. This was, in fact, part of the problem. The expansion of police authority in Kenya brought about the recruitment of young colonial administrators and policemen who had virtually no training and no grasp of legal principles. But this, in turn, was only part of the larger problem. There were those in the Kenyan colonial service who did indeed resemble the fictional character of Ronald Merrick, and thus the reaction in Britain, as well as in Kenya, to destroy the documents, as in the case of Ronald Merrick, that would damage the reputation of the colonial service, or for that matter, of the British Army. Now, what is driving this court case forward in London at the present is the allegation, the charge by the Kikuyu, or Mau Mau survivors, that violence in the detention camps had the sanction of highest officials within the British government. The examples of violence include an incident involving soldiers in the British Army in a gang rape and murder. It has taken monumental and persistent effort on the part of historians of Kenya to discover the evidence. The process of locating the legal evidence is what had triggered the discovery of the records of some 36 other dependencies, which the Foreign Office, FCO, had claimed to have lost or had no knowledge of. Now, these are broken and fragmented records, but they do serve to re-examine questions that are relevant to all colonial regimes, and the breakthrough in the documentation thus comes at a very appropriate time, the beginning of the Decolonization seminar at the Library of Congress, sponsored by the National History Center.